Mark Rogers TV on what has become our weekly Top 25 rant. And after that preseason poll, and then especially after the first game was played, it was easy to carve up the Top 25. There's so many flaws here. And I understand the more games they play, the more complex it becomes. And especially trying to compare teams that don't play anything close to the same type of schedule, it's difficult to do. Especially, again, once we play a number of games, then you have Team A beat Team B, that beat Team C, but C beat A, and it becomes a bit difficult. So you've got to go by the overall resume. But that's what I don't understand about the top 25. For some teams, they just have to win. But for other teams, they have to win impressively. The criteria is different for every team, and it's different for every voter. Some people base it on last season, and then they kind of allow this season to kind of flesh that out. But they start with last season's poll, which would be fine with me if we took last season's final poll and made that the preseason poll. That would be fine with me, making no assumptions or projections about what's going to happen this season. But we do that with some teams. We say, hey, this team finished number 15 last year, and they're just about the same this year. We're going to place them at number 15. Other teams, we say, well, they've gotten a lot better. We project them to be much better this season because they've got a lot of people staying, so we're going to bump them up. And other teams are going to completely fall off the map because they've graduated all these players. So it becomes projections. And I don't mind that even for a preseason poll. But once they play football, they should be judged strictly on how they've played. So either reward wins as wins, and they all equal the same, or we go by the eyeball test, and we need to do that for every team, and that's not the way it's done. So let's start at the top with Florida State. So if you just go based on wins and you start off Florida State as the number one team based on winning the BCS championship last year, that's fine. Florida State's number one. But we know that they didn't look good against Clemson. We know Jameis Winston not playing had probably much to do with that, and they did not look good against Oklahoma State. To their credit, Florida State has played two very capable football teams in Oklahoma State and Clemson. So, are we going with style points? If we do, Florida State cannot be number one. If we're just going with wins and losses and making a projection about the future, Florida State can be number one along with a number of other teams. Oregon possibly has the most impressive win of anyone in the country at this point, possibly. Defeating Michigan State, winning that game by 19 points and dominating the fourth quarter. Oregon did struggle mightily against Washington State, but again, do we look at that as a downer, a letdown, just winning by a touchdown against a Washington State team that has not won a game yet, or do they just win in advance? So is that a good win for Oregon, or is that a bad win? Oregon at number 2. Fortunately, we've got a number of SEC teams that will play each other. So out of the top 10, we've got Alabama 3, Auburn 5, Texas A&M 6, Ole Miss 10. All those teams play each other. That's great. So we can sort some things out there. Again, Alabama, Auburn, of course, Texas A&M, and Ole Miss all play each other coming out of that SEC Western Division. For Oklahoma at number 4, they just took on West Virginia in Morgantown. Was that an impressive win? I don't know enough about West Virginia. I know that they played Alabama very close. So based on that sample size, West Virginia is pretty good. They took Alabama to the fourth quarter, to the final 5 minutes, and Alabama turns around and they pretty much dominate Florida despite that game being 21-all sometime in the second half. Alabama, if you watch that game at the line of scrimmage, dominated Florida. They were the much better football team, substantially better than Florida, and we would expect that Florida's pretty decent. Probably going to go 8-4, maybe 7-5. Baylor. I have a huge issue with Baylor. Baylor right now is the 7th-ranked team in the country. If Oklahoma proves to be as good as Oklahoma could possibly be, and we expect to be, based on last season and also getting off to a good start this year, that's going to be a big game. Baylor also has some dates with Kansas State, who's a pretty good football team. Played Auburn tight within one score. They've got Oklahoma State. They've got some decent games to place. But at that point, let's judge Baylor when they finally play somebody. Right now, Baylor at number 7 has played nobody. What is it? It's SMU, who's getting killed by everybody, Northwestern State, and Buffalo. Those are the 3 Baylor games. If we're going to rate Baylor 7, then why not rate North Carolina State in the top 10? They're 4-0. They haven't played anyone either, but they're 4-0. You know what? Georgia Tech is 4-0, and they just beat Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech, of course, has a win against Ohio State. That's a more impressive resume. Georgia Tech at 4-0, defeating Virginia Tech, than Baylor. Penn State's 4-0, and they beat Central Florida, who's a decent team. Washington and Arizona are undefeated as well. Why don't we throw them in the poll as well? Doesn't make any sense. Michigan State has no quality wins. Of course, their one quality game was a loss at Oregon. So in a sense, they've got the best loss, if there is such a thing. Ole Miss at number 10 has yet to prove us anything, but they somehow leaped up to number 10 by beating Boise State by 22 points and haven't defeated anyone else worth note. UCLA at number 11, of course, they started the season at 7. They dropped because they were unimpressive in wins against Memphis and Virginia. Okay, and they also beat Texas by 3. Okay, next problem here, and I'm going to go back to it for the last few weeks. We got Georgia at 12, South Carolina at 13, according to the AP. They played each other. This is not difficult, people. They played each other. Now, if a 3-7 team after 10 games beats an 8-2 team, should they be ranked ahead of them? No. There's a resume at that point. At this point, the resume is very, very small. South Carolina beat Georgia head-to-head. They also beat them at Georgia. And they also beat East Carolina, who's proven to be a pretty good team with wins over Virginia Tech and North Carolina. So South Carolina has all of that on its resume. I know that Georgia beat Clemson, but they have the same resumes basically, and South Carolina won at Georgia. So Georgia's 12 and South Carolina 13. That makes no sense. I'm actually kind of surprised, gladly surprised, that Mississippi State leaped LSU. Sometimes you'll see that LSU being at number 8 and Mississippi State out of the poll. Mississippi State beating LSU. Actually, this time jumped them. Mississippi State at 14, LSU at 17. Makes sense. Got it right. Good. Stanford at 16, USC at 18. That doesn't make sense because, of course, they played. And USC, again, like the South Carolina-Georgia situation, won at Stanford. That doesn't make any sense either. LSU at 17 beat Wisconsin at 19. Makes sense, but look at the coaches' poll. The coaches' poll has Wisconsin over LSU. But, well, they both lost a game, and LSU came back and beat Wisconsin. They should not be ranked below them. They are in the coaches' poll. East Carolina continues to not get credit. East Carolina's got the tough loss against South Carolina, in which they played very well, losing 33-23. And East Carolina's got 2 quality wins against Virginia Tech, and they completely bludgeoned North Carolina. North Carolina was a preseason top 25 team, has not looked good, but up until the East Carolina game, at least won its 2 games. And East Carolina blew them out, scored 70 points, and they can barely get into the poll at 23. Again, their one loss is against South Carolina, and they've defeated Virginia Tech and North Carolina. Oklahoma State, I really don't understand what we do with Oklahoma State here. So they come out of the gate and they lose by 6 points, a one-possession game against Florida State, supposedly the best team in the country, with Jameis Winston. And they don't jump into the poll. I know they lost, but look who they lost to. So you can, again, do our loss is pretty, our loss is not pretty. We seem to have a different set of requirements for each team. So for Oklahoma State, see if this makes sense. They lose to Florida State in a very good game, 37-31. Then they turn around and defeat Missouri State and Texas San Antonio. And they jump into the poll for defeating Missouri State and Texas San Antonio. Likewise, Clemson was number 22. Did anyone watch the game against Florida State? I know they lost. That's all that matters. They lost. But again, we're ranking teams. This is not a standings. If these were standings, then everybody in the entire nation who has 0 losses should be ranked ahead of everybody that has 1 loss. If this is just merely standings. So they're not standings. So Clemson lost to Georgia, who we consider right now to be the 12th best team in the country. And Clemson, that game on the road. And then Clemson also lost on the road against Florida State. And if you watch that game, and we're supposed to be going by the eyeball test according to a lot of people, Clemson, they outplayed Florida State. Minus Jameis Winston, they outplayed Florida State. Okay, Clemson lost that game again. That's what matters. But they lost to the number 1 team in the country on the road, barely in overtime, and they dropped out of the poll. I don't get that. Just because they have 2 losses. That's the argument I've heard. Clemson has 2 losses, therefore they shouldn't be in the poll. Okay, I get that. But if we're playing by those rules, then 1-loss teams shouldn't be in the poll, either ahead of 0-loss teams, like Washington, Arizona, Penn State, North Carolina State, Georgia Tech. And then Kansas State, of course, they fall in the poll from 19 to 25 because they lost to Auburn, who's the 5th-ranked team in the country. And they lost to them 20 to 14, and their kicker missed 2 field goals, and they put the ball on the ground on the first possession. So Kansas State, in many ways, I'm not going to say they outplayed Auburn, but they played as well as Auburn, and they left chances out there. And, they're ranked at number 25. They fell 5 spots for losing to the number 5 team in the country by 1 score. Isn't that what the number 20 team is supposed to do when playing the number 5 team? And then finally, Boston College, of course, is not going to get any respect. They won another game on Saturday, and they beat USC, who is now ranked 18th in the country. And Boston College, of course, defeated USC. And they're 34th and 39th. That's their only loss. They lost to USC. So you've got to consider Pitt if you consider Boston College. I understand that. And you only have 25 slots. But some of these head-to-head matchups have to be taken into consideration. We look at the name. We look at the name brand when we see USC. We don't see that when we look at Boston College. But they played, and Boston College won, and they have 1 loss, and USC has 1 loss. So Boston College should be ranked ahead of USC. Now, if USC proves to be the better football team over time, that will play out. And in a few weeks, when USC beats some decent teams in the Pac-12, and Boston College fails to win games in the ACC, then USC will be ranked, and Boston College wouldn't be ranked. But for right now, Boston College won that game. So that should... I had somebody tweet me that why would a head-to-head matchup trump hundreds of games? Well, in comparing 2 teams, it doesn't trump hundreds of games. It trumps like 2 games. And again, I'm not trying to leapfrog a 1-2 team over like a 3-1 team because they beat them head-to-head. I'm just looking to make the head-to-head matchup the deciding factor between 2 teams, especially when they have the same record. All right, let's run down the top 25 right here on Mark Rogers TV. Please add your comments. Follow us on Twitter at Mark Rogers TV, and we will talk college football 24/7, 365.